iLead listeners, I am so thankful and grateful to have Dr. Antipas Harris with us. Oh my God, it's so much he's going to be sharing with us about leadership. I really need you to listen up. And I need you, if you are really keen and serious about social justice and how you can make a difference in the community, bring your leadership gifts to bear in that whole world, then you want to listen up. You want to share this. You want to make sure that you are part of this. Let me introduce our guest today. Antipas has dedicated his life to the fight for social justice and leading at the intersection of faith and public life. Two convictions undergird Antipas's life. The first is that he's convinced that people are eager to see things change for the good. And second, faith has an ongoing public role in our lives. Now, I used to think that I had a addiction to education until I met this brother. I used to think, will you please get out of the classroom and go do something, until I met this brother. So let me just share with you, over the 20 years, Antipas has served on several university faculties. We can't even name them all. He was also the founding president of Jake's Divinity School and Dallas, Texas. Antipas earned a bachelor's degree from LaGrange College, a master's degree from Emory University, a master's degree from Yale University, a doctor of ministry from Boston University, and a PhD from St. Thomas University. Welcome, Dr. Antipas Harris. Thank you for being a part of our iLead podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Dudley, for this opportunity. It truly is a privilege to have this conversation with you. And I'm kind of nervous because you're so learned and got much to offer.
Yeah,
that
right.
I wonder if I have much to match your genius. But I'm
Yeah,
not.
right. Okay, whatever. Thank you. I'm gonna hold my watch up until you finish, so it'll work after all of that you done poured
Uh,
on. Hey, so let's get into it. What's your definition of leadership? What is your definition of leadership?
yeah, good. I often borrow from John Maxwell, Leadership is Influence. Now, I know that it has to be revisited in more broadly speaking. What does that mean? And influence, what is positive leadership? There are it brings up a lot of questions, but I like to start there. Partly because one cannot lead if one has not gained the influence on the community that one is leading, especially today. Historically, people often followed people because they felt like they had to. Um, but today, people choose where they want to go. So gaining that, the influence of being able to pitch a vision or make a statement or say something that's influential that actually influences people. We talk about these social media influencers. Well, they're leaders because they could wear a certain outfit and everybody wants to wear it, or they can have a particular political opinion and people would start to believe in it. Um, but influence nonetheless.
Influence. You know, recently I read somewhere, I don't remember where, or in a conversation, and they suggested beyond influence. They said that leadership is a function as opposed to something or that you are or someone that you are. And I really thought about that in terms of, okay, function, I'm a leader, function, skill. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I think that when we think of leaders as functionary, or leadership as functionary, we risk not getting to leadership at all because it cannot be a sort of, in other words, you can't be hired to really be a leader, right?
Mm,
You hire people with, I think, the innate qualities, but that those qualities have to be matured. They, So it's a delicacy, are they born or are they made? I think they're kind of both, because the thing is, there's certain things that you can't be taught, they're caught, right? I often tell my students, there's only so much I can teach you about preaching, for example. But if it's not in you to be a good preacher, I can't put the gift in you. Now, I can help you develop that gift, but you got to have something to work with. So I think it's the same thing when it comes to leadership, that if a person does not have the raw qualities, it's very difficult to develop that person into the type of leader that they need to be to actually make a difference. That's one discussion. Now, one asks, okay, so what is this influence piece that you're talking about? I thought you said leadership is influence, but even that's a skill. Gaining influence is a skill, because we talk about people having charismatic personalities and things like
Mhm.
that. And so there's some people who can sell, ice in Alaska. Because they have, they can convince people on certain ideas and certain projects, and have people believing that it's something they need. A good salesman, for example. You can have on cut up jeans and they somehow convince you need cut up jeans, and you buy cut up jeans because it just influenced you to do it. Well, there's some skill they have there that's been developed, but there's also a quality there, a person that can be influential. And we often see it with kids when they haven't even been taught all the 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 lessons of leadership. But you can look at kids on the playground and see, ooh, that one's got leadership qualities.
Mhm.
And I would say that's innate to a certain extent. And then you sort of help that child develop those raw skills, if you will.
Yeah, it's that whole discussion, built or born. Do we
Yeah,
build them or are they born? God's response is to Jeremiah, I knew you when you're in your mother's womb. In
yeah,
Jeremiah's response to God's call, you know, sovereign God, his response. And the whole Hebrew word for was ouch. It's not that I'm you may have birthed me for this, God, but it doesn't feel good.
right.
And with respect to that, what are some of the things with coming to leadership, um, that you would say, you you really want to be a leader? And if you do, here are the things you need to guard your heart about.
Okay, so there are certain assumptions we have when we talk about leadership. At one level, we talk about leadership, we're thinking about a function, if you will, right?
Mm,
We
yeah.
say function as the president of a school, or function as the bishop or pastor of a church, or function as a CEO, right? So we say leadership is not a function, is innate ability, a skill to develop, but then at the same time, we have in the back of our minds, but leadership is within a functional capacity. I'm thinking about leadership as, in a way, when we talk about influence. Well, everybody has influence to some degree, somewhere,
To some
some,
degree, yes.
if it's in the office, if it's in home, everybody has some level of leadership. So, I mean, so the influence. So then everybody in that sense is a leader, varying responsibilities as a leader, but a leader nonetheless. And then there are the ones who have those particular um, have been cultivated in leadership, um, classes, training, development as leaders. Those folks are usually pursuing some kind of function as a leader, a particular idea, a CEO or president or something that actually puts them out front in a function of leadership. Because there are folks in functions of leadership that don't have the developmental skills to do the function. And then there are those who have the raw elements that need to be developed to fit the function, if you will.
Right.
So the folks out there that are saying, I want to be a leader, right? I would say those folks need to dig deep within to just rediscover or discover for the first time, what are those qualities that I have that matches my passion to do the function, and then seek out greater development, skills development, because the key is that some people have certain skills for a function, but don't have a maturated influence, skill of influence. So they can say build the house, but they can't run the team.
Hmm.
So they can build the house. They need to be the leader in building the house, but they also don't know how to build relationships. So they're destroying the team while they're building the house, if you will. There are some preachers can preach up a storm.
Yes.
They even have a vision for the type of church they want, but their only understanding of leadership is dictatorial or authoritarian, where they're not really gaining influence, where people are excited to be a part of the team. So they're oppressing their people or they're running them off. All the while, they have the element of leadership in terms of vision and in terms of the ability to do some of the hard work, like balance a book or raise money or things like that, but they don't know how to bring that influence into their own team. And part of it because we have certain ideas about leadership that are passed on to us from previous generations. I've seen a lot of leaders, they do well building relationship externally with the people they need to help them get the big picture done, but they forget that the people who are working in your camp also need to be positively influenced, and they shouldn't be working because they feel like they need the money or they feel like if I leave, I'm somehow going to hell. You know, some churches do that, make people feel like if you leave me, you're leaving God, kind of a thing. So it's this sort of fear tactic. And so they're not really using influence to draw in the people that are working alongside them. They create this mechanism of expectation.
Yeah, and I hear that and see that you can be trying to build externally to a church um, to reach the platform,
Right.
whatever platform you're shooting for,
Yeah.
but internally haven't really exerted a great deal of leadership. Um, when did you, speaking of leadership and doing those kinds of things, when did you begin to see yourself as a leader?
You know, it started a little bit young because I'm the oldest of five brothers. And I've always had this sort of protector personality, protecting my siblings, always wanted the best for them, and almost paternal in a way. If it's nothing but reminding them what dad said. And that was partly, I think, my position of birth, being the oldest boy, but also it was partly the way I was cultivated in the family. Uh, you know, there was an expectation placed upon me to make sure that I do the right thing so that they'll do the right thing. Because this expectation that they're going to follow the oldest brother. And it played out in several ways. It really kind of played out like that. I was the first musician, all the musicians. I was the first one of us. Now, my sister went to college before I did, but I was first among the brothers and I studied music. Well, two of them got music degrees and the other two actually studied music, but got other degrees, but they studied music in college. Um, you know, I went into ministry. Two of my younger brothers are in ministry. Now, I also follow my dad in ministry as well. So there, you know, I was leading, but I was also following. But it was this sort of expectation placed in the family. Family is really important when it comes to cultivating gifts. And so I think that's the primal classroom. So in some ways, I had the raw materials, but I was cultivated in that framework in my home environment.
You know, the that whole piece of being cultivated in terms of leadership and the environment is so critical in forming you. I've read that the way you lead initially is going to be directly connected to the family system in which you came out of.
Yeah.
You
And
may
that,
learn how to lead later differently,
yeah.
but when your first thing you learn how to lead and or follow or neither, coming out of that first organization that you were in, and that's family.
Yeah, and you see, here's something that I like to contribute to this conversation, and that is, if you really look at leadership cultivation or skill development, it is done within an environment that affirms failure as much as success. And by what I mean by affirm, I don't mean approve, but when one fails, they're also drawn back in. I think part of the challenge is sometimes we think take a leadership class and you get it right every time. You got to be allowed to fail, because you got what is really affirmed is your humanity is affirmed as separate from what you did, right? So you can get a spanking as a kid, but now come here and give me a hug because I love you and affirm your humanity. It was what you did. I think part of the challenge in our society is very performance driven. Even our evaluations when we're for leadership, it's all based on performance. There's little affirmation of human dignity. It's more, how are you doing? Did you fail? Did you win? And I think that it's very hard to develop leaders in that context. That's only skill development like that is only one part of what it means to be a leader, is what I mean. So an environment, I'm a church guy, so I always relate these things back to church. If you look at the landscape of ministries across the country, in particular in America, almost every large church pastor, successful leader that built something really large came from something really small.
Wow.
And yeah, I mean, we can talk from a Bishop Jakes, or we can talk of Billy Graham. Both came from these small situations, and there's a laundry list. Those are only two of the very large, but it's that way across the board. Came from something small, and many of the large churches actually don't produce themselves.
Wow.
They
Wow.
don't. Yeah,
Wow.
many of the large.
Unpack that. You have data on that, or this is anecdotal?
Is anecdotal at this point. I'm in the process of trying to build something out of this, but it has been noted that large churches, large ministries, the leaders tend to come from smaller beginnings, and those churches often struggle to come up out of the ranks from salvation to maturity, something that is large. They influence a lot of large ministries, but I mean birthing and maturating something that becomes as large or larger than themselves. My hypothesis is that because in small situations, it's a laboratory. Easter Sunday, you get up and you do your speech, and it wasn't good, but they told you it was good, and you're gonna be good, you're gonna be just fine. And you get to fall and get up again, even if you make a moral mistake, right? You get set down, and you can bounce back, and you can develop more. And mama will have your grandma, the mother in church have you at the house for dinner. You go out, there's this certain congregational formation that can happen that maturates and maturates and develops something that then produces something great in the world. But once it becomes great in the world, that's a performance. That's a stage for performance, right? You can't afford to have those same kind of
Practical.
small church failures. You just can't afford. That's a practical reality.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is it's difficult to maturate because you just have to produce. When I was young and a preacher, I preached so much, some of those sermons weren't good enough for anybody to even be sitting there listening at.
I know that's right.
Like, I don't even know what I was talking about. I don't know, you don't know what I was talking about, but you told me it was good, and you hugged me, and you affirmed my humanity and my call, even when my performance wasn't that great. That's what I'm getting at. But once you get on the big stage, the performance is primal.
Number one,
So,
baby.
right. So then the point is, how do you develop leaders that are not just based on performance? You can't develop it in an environment that is based on performance.
Yeah, you cannot. And
You see what I
that
mean?
leads, I see exactly what you mean. And that's a great hypothesis. I never thought about that. You're really causing me to think, because now I'm thinking, okay, here I am. We're definitely not a mega situation. We're a nice sized church. And I'm looking at planting other churches, but they won't be the same size as this church.
Right.
And so I see exactly what you're saying, and the practicality of it. And it just leads me to this next question that I wanted to ask you. You're talking about encouraging and people encouraging to be a leader. Who can you point to say this person's thumbprint is on my leadership? They encourage me the most.
Yeah. I think it'd be very difficult to say one person. It's a community of people.
Mm.
And that community, I can name them in just a second, but that community of people, um, their fingerprint is all over my life and leadership. My dad is one. My mom is one. I would say Alfred Watts on the administrative side. Alfred Watts, the pastor of Cornerstone Christian Center in Milford, Connecticut. Um, bless his soul, Bishop William M. Philpott, who's deceased now, but he was the bishop of Christ Chapel New Testament Church in Connecticut. I would say my professors, John Cook, for an example, was one. I think Luke Timothy Johnson at Emory. I would say Harry Attridge at Yale Divinity, and bless his soul, Lamansano. I would say bless his soul. He's also deceased, but Dale Andrews, who was at Boston University at the time, and Brian Froley, who's my PhD dissertation advisor. Let me mention Michael Palmer, who used to be the dean at Regent University. All those folks' fingerprint are on my leadership style.
Wow.
Partly because they are, everyone that I just mentioned allowed me or saw weaknesses and sought out opportunities to help me strengthen my weaknesses.
Speaking, and before you finish that thought, I want to just add to that. Speaking of weaknesses, I want to add two things to that. Who was the person that discouraged you, and how did you overcome your weakness?
Person who discouraged me. Let me think. Okay, so there were folks even in my early formation when I was young. I had learning disabilities, a speech impediment. And I can't say in those. Well, I can say that when I was in the public school, I had some teachers, one in particular, that I felt was more against me than trying to help. And there was a certain amount of inferiority that developed because I knew my own weaknesses. I didn't need anybody to remind me of that. Or even if I didn't know, once I learned, I didn't need to keep you reminded. But I thought that she was not in my best interest. And I thought that the relationship with that teacher was adversarial. And for that reason, my dad took me out of the public schools, and he started a school at our church, and I graduated high school from our church school, Christian Way Academy. And I always appreciate my dad for that, because education became adversarial because that teacher made me feel like I was her enemy when I came in the classroom, because I couldn't function at the level that she expected me to. So I became I don't think she would have seen me as one most likely to succeed. And then so the same thing kind of happened when I was in my doctoral program at Boston University. There were some professors there who, that young boy, and that's the thing with a man, and Bishop Jakes talks about this. Every man has a little boy in him. Every woman has a little girl. And when I was working on my D-Min, I reconnected with that little boy quickly because I felt like some of the professors there was kind of like my elementary school teacher who didn't see me as the most likely to succeed. So I became their punching bag in a way where they used the rule of the law rather than relationship. And that was, I can tell you another person who helped me during that time was Dana Roberts. She is the historian at Boston University. She'd call me in the office, and she was not one to 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 show a lot of grace when it came to education. She really wanted you to toe the line, but she also saw something in me that wasn't as apparent when I was going through some very difficult times in education. So here's this thing where you can affirm a person's gifts and critique their performance at the same time. And that is necessary when you're developing leaders, affirming the gift and reassuring them that the gift is there. And at the same time, not ignoring the challenge or the deficiency, if you will. And I
And,
think,
go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
and I think as a teacher, as a professor, as a leader who is raising a leader of leaders, one has to develop that ability to do both of those at the same time. And because of the future, that student will appreciate one for that. Because you can't be more fragile than when you're going through, when you believe this call on your life and you know you have the gifts and you have the raw materials, but you're not performing as well.
Yeah, that is very, very difficult to deal with when you are not meeting your own expectations.
Right, right.
That is difficult. Those moments never leave you. I wanted to ask you this in terms of the person that was kind of uh, opposing, discouraging. Let's go down that same line. What obstacles did you have to overcome?
Okay, so I had to overcome my own, you know, inabilities. And I would say that when I had the learning challenge, I also was vision impaired. And this is something my parents didn't know at first. So there were times when I was in the classroom and I just couldn't see the board. And instead of me saying I can't see what you're writing on the board, I just pretend that I think I assumed that nobody could really see the board. Because I was like, if I can't see it, they probably can't see it. Not realizing I was vision impaired at the time. So I fell behind because I couldn't follow. So that was one issue. The next thing I think that I was part of my challenge had to do with um, this sort of inferiority that developed. You know, one thing to have disabilities, and it's another thing to be inferior. And I think that I develop an inferiority that even haunts me until today, because whenever I go into a situation, personally, I go in as a little boy with a learning disability. I go in seeing that I'm the least among the crowd. That's not where it trips me up, is doesn't always play that way on the other side. Because when people read my pedigree and know the things I've achieved, they have an assumption when they come in the room as well, that I'm smarter than somebody in a certain area, or that I, or whatever that thing is they think about me. And sometimes you play into it because when you feel inferior, you try to overcompensate so it won't be that apparent that you're inferior. You want to come off as a person who has confidence, and you really don't. And so what happens is people misread that sometimes. They see it as cocky when actually
Okay.
I'm not. I'm trying to live up to this doctor thing that you guys think I came in here with. And that's not really me at all. I'd rather be the plain guy, so you don't have these expectations, because I don't know if I can meet your expectations.
Wow. And the thing is, and let me just pause and remind our iLead listeners right now, what you just heard is a tremendous leader in the community and in the body of Christ and in the whole academic world. You heard him say that he struggled with his own sense of self and confidence. You heard him say um, that he had two things that was against him that he came to this earth with, um, and that is seeing and learning. Is that not right?
That's right.
And now let me remind the listeners and those who are watching, you are listening and watching Dr. Antipas Harris, who has a bachelor's degree from LaGrange College, a master's degree from Emory University, a master's degree from Yale University, a doctor of ministry degree from Boston University, just in case if that rings a bell, that's the same place that Dr. Martin Luther King got his PhD, a doctor of philosophy PhD from St. Thomas University. What I'm trying to say to those of you who are watching, listening right now, is that no matter what you come to this earth with, and we all are going to come with some sense of vulnerability, some sense of lack, something that we don't have that we wish we did. That does not stop you from becoming a leader. I just really wanted to press that in because I really, I thought I knew you until you shared all of that.
No,
Wow.
it's true. I get. That's the thing that some people. It's like the performance thing we were talking about.
Yeah.
These things create a beautiful picture of a performer, but at the end of the day, everybody has a humanity that we struggle with, and we have gifts and talents that have to be developed alongside the skills that we have. That's why I really focus in theological education heavily on formation, this concept of formation. You can't just learn to preach, teach, lead, see from a cerebral perspective. And you have to be formed into the thing. That's why.
Say that again. I want our listeners and viewers to get that. First of all, this whole academic term from the academy, if you will, of formation. Help our listeners and those who are watching understand what you mean, what the academy means with formation, and what you mean with formation.
Mhm. So in the academy, we talk about, say, for example, tacit knowledge, exposure, where you know more than you can explain. So if we're trying to help people to learn, you can't just teach from the textbook. You got to give them some kind of exposure so they can catch it, right? Because there's a part in the brain that receives in a way that it cannot explain. So that person, and you've talked about it before, Dr. Dudley, this whole receiving in a place in your brain, and you can't even articulate what it is that is in you, but that thing forms the way you think, um, and well, that's exposure for a large part. Similarly, what I'm talking about formation is this need for holistic development. In other words, if I want to be a pastor, I got to do more than be able to preach. I got to also live into it fully with all of who I am. So this my moral development, for example, the way I make decisions need to accompany this positioning of leadership. The way I treat others, the way my knee-jerk reaction or how I refrain from knee-jerk reaction, allow more processed thinking before I respond to something that can be traumatic or it can be an insult. How do I respond to it and not just react, right? Will Smith goes on stage and he slaps the comedian, Chris Rock. To be frank, on one hand, I say, because I'm a person that just does not like, it makes me feel bad when people, what we say in the community, joan me, right? And if you joan me or anybody around me that has a physical disability or any kind of disability, something within me reacts. And it's partly because I had a disability, right? So when somebody says something about somebody with a physical or mental or something like disability, it that's not funny to me. And so when a comedian did it in this context, I immediately, right or wrong, I don't know Will Smith, but I immediately felt what he claimed to have felt. I was like, she could have cancer. She could, I mean, you don't make fun of people with a bald head. You don't know why they, this is going to, that. But if you're going to be in a leadership role, you don't now get up and go on stage and slap the person, right? There's a deficiency here. You can't react to every emotion when you're a leader. You shouldn't do it as a person. That's an undeveloped person, right? So, so that's that. So my point here is that when I talk about being formed as a leader, I'm talking about character as well as I'm talking about skill, right? I'm talking about the ability to make quick judgment, sound judgment, and to hold oneself accountable, where another person doesn't always have to hold you accountable to a decision, because you have the tools for self-reflection.
Yeah, it has to do with, and I'm looking on my bookshelf here. Here we go. It has to do with emotional intelligence.
Yes.
That's what it has to do with. It has to do with and social intelligence and relational intelligence, and whether or not one can, and all of those things are extremely important in developing a leader. In fact, there are studies now that lends more to people being certified in their relational abilities, their emotional abilities, more so than the formal training that you and I struggle through. And because that's so important now. And one of the things that are happening is that we did not get a lot of this in our family structures. That this didn't happen in our family structures. And so, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Part of it didn't happen in our family structures because of brokenness in families. Now we talk about brokenness at one level as the father was not there, or in some cases, the mother was not physically there, physical sort of brokenness in families. But then there's this element of brokenness that can happen even with two parents present. Because you can be physically present, not emotionally present.
Exactly.
Right. You
exactly.
can be, so there's that going on. And then there is this dysfunctionality that can happen even in what would appear to be a fully formed family, emotional presence and physical presence. But if there is not, sometimes people experience abuse that's become normal for them.
And therefore stunt their abilities to lead themselves. I like to deal with this whole thing about
also, Dr. Dudley, if I can insert right there,
yeah, go ahead.
That part of it also has to do with the way they go out from that family to lead and behave in the world. So in other words, if I've seen the way that my dad and mom interact, we've just normalized violence in the house, where slapping happens. I mean, that happened historically, even in Black families. Every Friday night, the wife wore beaten, and she was still there for 50 years down the road. So that was a emotional presence, right? There was emotional presence. There was also a physical presence, but there was a normalizing of abuse. So then a child who is raised in that environment could go out, a son, and think that that's how he's supposed to behave in the world.
And so then what do you say with all those impediments, with all of those environmental issues, with all of those both physical as well as emotional? What do you say to the emerging leader who wants to enter leadership, period, and then in particular, enter the leadership in the world that you're in, social justice world, leading in our community? What do you say to them, how they become a leader in this kind of a situation?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, that there needs to be, you have to have passion for the type of leadership that I do, because there are no systemic structures to accommodate it, right? It's like Martin Luther King Jr. He was not a politician with sort of a public sanctioned job to do what he was doing. He was driven by passion and a call. So he carves out his community leadership with relationships, influence that was not hired nor appointed. So the way I enter into the space where I am not the senior pastor of a local church where I was voted in or appointed to be the pastor of that church or built it myself, but it's my duty. You enter into the public square and you see a problem. You build the relationships with the units in the community and you build a rapport with those folks, and show genuine interest and have you have to have good standing as a human person, that your standing is not hinged upon a requirement by the job as in a job description, but it's a requirement based on an inner compass, right? You have
I
to develop.
love. I've never looked at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. leadership as something that he had to carve out a space, but that's exactly what happened.
Yeah,
That's exactly what happened. He
yeah,
he came in, the position did not exist.
right.
He created it by the force of his call and his influence and his leadership.
Hmm.
That's powerful. So that's what you would tell a younger, a millennial, a Gen X, or whatever the case may be, in terms of if they see something in their life, they need to go and carve that out in the community, so that they can then do that.
Build a model, build a model, because what happens is people have a desire and they sit around and wait for an opportunity, but they define opportunity by somebody invite them to do something, and that invitation may never come because there is, I see myself, and it's partly my theology, I see humanity as called to be divine co-creators with God. It's like in the beginning, God stooped down, if we follow the Genesis story, and he scoops up clay, he blows in it, and he forms man and a woman, right? But God's not doing that every day. After he formed in that fashion, or fashioned that woman and man, he then compelled them to co-create. So they have to do something sexual to have a child. That you and I can't sit around and say we want children and think they're just going to pop out of the sky or somebody, that we are co-creators of human. That means we are co-agents of divine, we're co-divine agents in God's creation of humanity. And I take that as a foundational theological framework to say that we are called as human agents to co-create in the world, co-create justice, co-create. We talk reconciliation. What are we going back to? Reconcile sound like you going back to something. No, we're called to be conciliatory agents in the world. And there is no blueprint for what we need. We got to create it. And we got to have the influence to corral the community together to see, so that they can see themselves as participants in this co-creation of justice. So that's my foundational approach to taking faith to the public square. I am not looking for opportunity that exists. I'm looking, how can I create the next possibilities to be co-creators, co-creator of righteousness and justice in the world.
So right now, Black Lives Matter, they created.
Yes.
They did exactly what you're saying, and what I hear you suggesting to the emerging leader, you may not be able to co-create a Black Lives Matter that goes international, worldwide, global, but you can co-create in your own sphere of influence to be the leader God has called you to be.
Yeah, and make it a model. Like you may have to create a nonprofit to do it. You might have to create a for-profit to do it, or you might could be a free. I mean, pastors are. I mean, you're saying you're going into areas like Columbus, Georgia, to build churches, right? So the idea is that you're going in to build a structure to achieve God's work. Now, it's a structure that we all can relate to because we've seen a church before, but it's the same kind of thing. In order to enter into a space, you got to create something that will, again, it may be an organization, may not be an organization. I mean, it could be a movement, right? Um, or it could be to join in forces and be a connector. I met a guy at the Grammys and asked him what he did. He's an entrepreneur. What I do is I'm a connector. That's what I do, and I do it for a living. Connecting, disconnecting people, go around finding all these random gifts all over the world, and then being able to connect one gift with another gift to see how they can build something together. Then go do the same thing. And he says, I'm the creator. I'm the connector. So it's amazing how he
Wow.
took that gift of networking and built a multi-million-dollar empire. And you ask
Wow.
him what he does, he said, I connect talents. He came up to me, I had on my suit, came up to me, hey, man, I like that suit. Where are you from? What do you do? So popping the question. Next thing I know, he wants my number. He wants, oh, wow, I can connect you with this. I can connect. And that's what he does.
Wow.
That's what he does. And so what I similarly, I felt very connected with him because I'm a connector in that way. My philosophy, though, is connect resources with needs. So sometimes it is apparent that I did it, and sometimes it's not. There are times when things happen in the community that I clearly did that, but nobody knows it because that's not the point. That was not the point that I did it. The point was that it got done.
That it
And
got done.
some of these things don't need, my name does not need to be on a neon sign because the people who doing it know that I mean, when you're doing it, it's like the things you do as a pastor, right? People don't know half the stuff you do because that's not the point that they know.
No, it's not, because the
Right, what
point is
service to humanity? Yeah,
the outcome and the
yeah,
service to humanity. You know,
right.
we're coming to kind of a in close to our time,
Mhm.
and I got to ask you this question. I ask everybody from governors that's been on iLead to senators. It doesn't matter, to chief of police. They get this question that you're gonna get here, Dr. Antipas. And I don't, Harris. I don't know whether or not my team got it to you beforehand. Um, I hope they didn't, because you're not supposed to know it until right now. And so you're ready for it?
I'm ready for it.
How do you lead in any room you find yourself in?
How do I lead in any room that I find myself in?
Yeah.
I think that it goes to the interest that you show to the people in the room. In other words, leadership is not passive. Nobody has to follow. It's connected to this concept of influence. When one goes in the room and one is more interested in the people in the room and what they do, you immediately gain leadership. Because now people want to know, so what do you do? It is like the question that everybody has. They're going to cater to the person who shows interest in them. It's the same thing as a teacher. When you show interest in the students, you gain influence and you don't have to say, I'm the teacher here. You don't have to remind people that. People are going to want you to be the teacher if you come in the spirit of humility. And so that's what I think, really. I don't think I think it's a gift. Some people have charismatic gifts, but if you have a charismatic gift, but your approach is toxic, then you kind of turn everybody in the room off, right?
Mhm.
So I think it has to do with the humility of support of the people that are in the room.
Wow. Wow. It's always amazing to me when I ask that question, how similar the answers are.
Really?
So similar to the answers. And as I said, from our governor here in Illinois, our two US senators, and so on and so forth that I've had on iLead. And they all focus around the other persons in the room and listening to them.
Yes.
Therein lies the ability to lead in any room. I've always thought that'd be interesting, really interesting. Well, Dr. Harris, we're at the end of our time together, and I just want to give you the opportunity. First of all, thank you so much for taking time. We're honored that you would take time out of your busy schedule to speak into the lives of our listeners, our iLead listeners and viewers. Is there anything parting that you would like to share, in particular, again, to that person, that young man or woman who is making every effort to become the leader that they believe God had called them to be?
Well, first of all, Dr. Dudley, I really appreciate you thinking of me and having me on your podcast because you're an extraordinary leader yourself, things you have accomplished, to even be asked to be in this sort of chorus, a cloud of witnesses with governors and leaders that you have included on this podcast is a gift to me. What I like to say to that young person, to your question, I like to encourage them. Some principles I wrote in my book, Unstoppable Success. One of them is connect with somebody who is going in the direction that you're going, and don't just connect with anybody. Be very particular about connecting with people who are going in a direction of success, interested in leadership, interested in, a professor said to me at Emory University, John Hayes, he said, Antipas, you want to be a scholar, pick up any paper on the floor, read anything that's positive. He says, don't restrict it to theology books, but read theology books. If you're going to be a scholar, read everything you can get your hands on. So that's my encouragement to you. Read everything you can get your hands on. Learn, absorb, absorb, absorb. It's not about believing it, agreeing with it. It's just learning it. And then the last piece to that is connect with someone who's already where you want to go. Already there, so that that person could share lessons that they have learned. And again, it's not so their lessons become your template, but their lessons become an inspiration to you, where you can try to avoid some of the pitfalls and take into consideration some of the lessons they've learned in your own developmental process.
Wow. Wow. Well, iLead listeners, you've heard it. And I think you've heard it from one of the best, one of our leaders in the body of Christ and in our community. Thank you so much for being a part. And please, if this bless you, bless somebody else. Share it. Don't keep it to yourself. Thank you, Dr. Harris.
Thank you, Dr. Dudley.
Did it end?
Still recording.
You're still recording? Okay. So what'd you think?
Enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes, likewise, likewise. Dagny, you get everything? I think she had to step away. I was texting her. I was trying not to show that I was texting her. She's working from, had to go out of state actually to tend to her mother. So she was working there and trying to talk to me and do everything else. But thank you so much, man. I got to go record my midweek service.
Okay, thank you so much. All right.